Hey guys, in today's video, we're going to talk about age-related cognitive decline. It's a pretty lengthy topic, so we are going to split it into two videos. The first part is we'll talk about a brief overview of some of the causes of age-related cognitive decline. And the second part, we'll talk about some therapies. So just to start off, all humans will develop some level of cognitive decline. In some individuals, it's as early as their 20s, and it's manifested by a drop in brain volume, myelin integrity, impaired neurotransmitters, as well as deterioration in the mitochondrial membranes in your neurons. And here's a diagram of a neuron connecting with another neuron, and we'll call this the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. And so basically the idea is chemical signals, which are neurotransmitters that attach to these receptors on dendrites, are converted to electrical signals, which pass through the cell membrane into your axon and then propagate and end in your axon terminal, which these little buds are right here. And at the axon terminal, neurotransmitters are released, at which point they're bound to the receptors on your dendrites, and the whole thing repeats itself. And so you have the postsynaptic cell right here, and the presynaptic cell, with the synapse being the little gap between the axon terminal buds and the dendrites. So the axon terminal buds of the presynaptic neuron and the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron, right? And so ideally, as we get older, or as it seems as we get older, we get a drop in the amount of these functional units, these neurons, which are millions upon millions in your brain when you're younger, and the myelin integrity and axonal length, so the length of these axons, as well as the amount of myelin. Myelin is kind of a conducting material, but conducting substance. It fair amounts consists of cholesterol, and it helps increase the speed, accelerate the speed of the signal, the chemical signal within, or the electrical signal within your neurons. And deterioration of mitochondrial membrane, so obviously mitochondria are found within the cell body of these neurons. These all in turn seem to lead to cognitive dysfunction. And then we see forgetfulness, decreased focus, decreased problem-solving capacity that may lead over time to dementia and depression, as well as Alzheimer's in patients. And so the one thing you want to keep in mind is it does not affect all patients equally, right? This whole process of cognitive decline can be decreased. The rate of decline can decrease significantly if you do certain steps. But first, let's talk about some of the causes for decline. Well, oxidative stress. So this really refers to the balance between free radical free radical production, basically molecules that have an unpaired electron, and antioxidants, molecules that can donate the electron, and these basically render these particular molecules inactive, right? And so the brain is at a higher risk for development of these free radicals or reactive oxygen species because of the amount of oxygen that's delivered to the brain, right? And reactive oxygen species do have a role in that they are a byproduct of mitochondrial metabolism. They're important in energy production, as well as they're utilized in terms of destroying pathogens, right? But it's only when there is a larger amount of these than there are antioxidant molecules like glutathione that you tend to have oxidative stress, right? And the issue with oxidative stress is it can lead to DNA damage, as well as disruption of cell membranes, which of course can lead to neuronal death. And there have been several studies that have shown that patients who have Alzheimer's disease or dementia tend to have byproducts of oxidation, thiobarbiturate acid reactive substances. They seem to have high levels of these and decreased levels of glutathione. So whatever you can do to improve oxidative damage may help reduce the risk of you developing these disorders. What about inflammation in general? So ideally, reducing inflammation is very important. Why? Because with higher levels of inflammation, you may disrupt your blood-brain barrier. Your blood-brain barrier is basically a group of cells that aligns blood vessels that are perfusing the brain, and it's done in an effort to reduce the amount of inflammatory molecules or substances or pathogens that can enter. So you have these really tight junctions between endothelial cells, these cells that line the blood vessel, along with certain cells of parasites, astrocytes, and cerebral microglia or cerebral macrophages, which can attract white blood cells or actually engulf the pathogens if necessary. And if you have chronic inflammation, it'll lead to breakdown of this whole blood-brain barrier matrix. And the issues with it is that if you engage in activities like smoking, or if you're obese, or you have disruptive sleep patterns, the tight junctions in the endothelium can be disrupted as well. Certain irritants, things that environmental irritants or dietary irritants that seem to stimulate certain cytokines like IL-1 beta, IL-6, IL-8, TNF-alpha, can then they themselves destroy existing neurons and are more able to easily pass with a disruption of the blood-brain barrier. And one important lab marker to look at is your high sensitivity C-reactive protein, which is a marker of generalized inflammation in the blood. And so there have been several studies that have shown that higher levels of HSCRP are associated with poor reaction time, recall, and processing of new data, and Alzheimer's and dementia. Hormonal balance. So if your hormones are imbalanced, this can also lead to cognitive decline. There have been several studies that have looked at estrogen, testosterone, thyroid, and DHEA as being associated with cognitive aging. Here's one that looks at estrogen and cognitive aging in women. It's a good review article, and I'll put all these articles in the bottom in the description of the YouTube video. And in this article, the conclusions stated that the results of these animal and human studies indicate that initiation of an estrogen therapy at the time of menopause or soon after ovarectomy provides a window of opportunity for the protection of memory in females. So important to optimize estrogen for sure. And then this article looked at testosterone administration in hypogonadal men with Alzheimer's disease, and looked at all the articles associated with them. It's also another review article. And what they found is that there was some positive results. The majority of studies show that T administration improved memory and cognition in Alzheimer's disease, which is very promising. And this particular study looked at DHEA, and it mentioned that in women, DHEA can impose cortisol effects, which in turn will reduce distraction, and that higher DHEA responses may enhance working memory at the electrophysiological level. So in this particular study, what they did was they looked at 23 young women performing tests of memory, right? And they also correlated with electroencephalogram readings. And what they found is that women that had a higher baseline cortisol to DHEA ratio, so higher cortisol levels in relation to DHEA, had more distraction, and whereas those individuals that had higher DHEA production had better working memory. So that's kind of interesting. And then the other article that was important was Pregnenolone, right? And Pregnenolone is an important neurosteroid. And for some time, we had known that it acts in the CNS and it acts as a cognitive enhancer, but we didn't know what exactly it did. And so recently, this particular article looked at a lot of the articles surrounding Pregnenolone, and it appears that it seems to work in terms of modulating the NMDA receptor, or rather synaptic transmission of NMDA, and by virtue of this, it seems to improve memory and as well as mood and cognition. So all in all, making sure that your estrogen, testosterone levels, your thyroid hormone levels, as well as DHEA and pregnenolone levels are optimized can make a big difference in the progression of cognitive decline. What about cerebrovascular health? So one way in which we can determine your vascular health is to look at the large perfusing artery to the brain, and that's the carotid artery. You can see it right here. See the common carotid artery. On the left side, it comes off the aorta. On the right side, it comes off the innominate artery. And this branches off to produce or perfuse many of the areas of the brain, right? And so it's very important that these carotid arteries are open and have appropriate blood flow. And over time, if you develop atherosclerosis, that of course will decrease blood flow and decrease the oxygen, nutrients, and glucose that the brain needs. And one way to determine that is to do a CIMT scan, or carotid intima medial thickness scan, which looks at the intima medial thickness. And that is basically the thickness of these inner membranes of the artery. The larger the thickness, the more evidence of atherosclerosis you have. And you have in this individual, you can see the carotid arteries here, and the arrows are representative of the thickness. And you can see the thickness is very small, but whereas in this individual, you can see plaque formation in the carotid arteries and the thickness is decreased, right? So more of this is likely to reduce perfusion and potentially can lead to cognitive decline. In addition, if you have HDL levels less than 30, so if you look at your lipid panel and your HDL is less than 30, that's also associated with significant decrease in mini mental status exam in elderly individuals, which is a marker of cognition. HDL, of course, is the lipoprotein that's important in moving cholesterol from the periphery to the liver. What about homocysteine? So homocysteine is another marker that is associated with blood flow to the brain, and elevated levels are associated with decreased blood flow, right? And as well as an increase in strokes. And so keeping your levels under 10 micromoles per liter, and you can do so with a good B complex vitamin and reduction of red meat in your diet, can help for sure. And then high blood pressure itself. So the issue with high blood pressure is, and you're like, well, I mean, isn't that more blood flow to the brain? Well, the problem is with higher pressures, you can break down these cerebral capillaries, which are derivatives of arteries. Arteries go to arterioles, which go to capillaries. And with the breakdown of these capillaries, you get decreased flow to areas of the brain near certain neurons. And this in turn can lead to cognitive impairment and development of degenerative diseases such as dementia. Also, one concern is that you can develop a stroke, right? Higher blood pressures can lead to a hemorrhagic stroke, right? Where a blood vessel might burst. And then ideally, you want to keep your blood pressure under 130/80, with 115/75 being excellent. What about diabetes and insulin resistance? Well, this clearly is associated with cognitive decline. It's been linked to decreased brain volume, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and there's been multiple studies that have looked at a healthy glucose metabolism and the fact that it's been associated with improved cognition, in particular memorization. And so here's an article that actually looked at just the presence of diabetes and how it affected brain atrophy and vascular lesions. And so what they did was they looked at 1,000 individuals with symptomatic arterial disease, right? And what they found is that if you had diabetes on top of it, right, you had an added detrimental effect, right? So what they found was that patients with both arterial disease and diabetes had more global and subcortical brain atrophy. So the cortex as well as the brainstem and midbrain, and they had a higher likelihood for lacunar infarcts, which are infarcts along the brainstem, the internal brainstem, internal capsule, versus those individuals that just had arterial disease. So if you just had atherosclerosis without diabetes, you're much less likely to have you're likely to have less atrophy. So it definitely has an additive effect. And then the other thing to remember is you want to keep your fasting insulin levels under 15 millunits per liter. Now, ideally, I like to keep these under 10 milli-international units per liter. And the reason behind it is the lower you keep these, the lower on the scale you are in terms of, eventual diabetes. And unfortunately, your fasting glucose as well as your hemoglobin A1C may catch it at a later period of time, right? You may actually start to experience macrovascular complications, atherosclerosis, and microvascular complications. This would be primarily atherosclerosis in the retina and the kidneys and the brain, right? You may already start to have some damage, particularly macrovascularly, if you wait until your hemoglobin A1C is above 5.7. However, insulin secretion seems to be a more sensitive marker of catching it earlier on. So looking at your fasting insulin levels and ensuring that they're under 15, ideally under 10, is one way to keep diabetes at bay. Obesity. So there are structural brain changes associated with being overweight and being obese. And this is a review article that actually talked about them. And it actually said that in general, there is smaller cortical thickness and reduction in the gray matter volume in people who are overweight and obese. And what they felt was adipocytes, macrophages of the adipose tissue, and gut dysbiosis in overweight and obese individuals result in the secretion of these cytokines and chemokines, which in turn can cause inflammation, which in turn can cause the chronic low-grade neuroinflammation and be an important factor for cellular death and neuronal death, which in turn, of course, will cause the brain atrophy. So that's just an important thing to point out, that obesity and more specifically the increase in these adipocytes can lead to inflammation and of course brain atrophy. And so one thing to keep in mind is keeping the waist under 40 inches. That's associated with dementia and cognitive decline is key. And exercise. So there have been multiple studies that have suggested aerobic and anaerobic exercise increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and the lack of it therefore also decreases this. And this is an important factor in term that's associated with neuronal growth and synaptic connections. Remember the connections between the neurons. And it is important to do both aerobic and anaerobic. Both of them the combination of the two seems to have a synergistic effect on BDNF increases. And then the other part, of course, is you not only do you need physical exercise, but mental exercise. So novel cognitive stimuli. So basically learning more, reading more, engaging with the community is going to be really important to improve brain plasticity. And then finally, the last aspect, and this is something that many of us tend to, overlook, is just having a good social network. And so just disengagement, the idea of being isolated or having social isolation, is highly correlated with cerebral decline. So, being in relationships which are conducive to health, where you're actively engaging with each other, volunteering in the community, having some sort of connection with the community is really key. This particular article, it looked at perceived social isolation being correlated with brain structure and cognitive trajectory in Alzheimer's patients. And they basically looked at 176 elderly patients who had complaints of memory problems and mild cognitive impairment, and they underwent structural MRI and neuropsych testing. What they found was the individuals who described themselves as being lonely had decreased gray matter volume in the bilateral thalamus, right? And the thalamus is an important area of the brain that's associated. It's more like a sensory relay station where information in regards to visual inputs, smell, taste, touch is relayed to the cerebral cortex. So obviously, an impairment in that area can affect cognition. And so that is pretty much it. In the next video, we'll kind of talk about therapies that we can do to combat some of these issues associated with age-related cognitive decline. And I hope that this video has been helpful. I know it's a complicated topic, but these are just some areas that you can focus on if you want to really reduce the rate of memory loss and your processing ability as you get older.